I'm pleased to have in the studio with me Harvey Kaye, Professor Harvey Kaye, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Washington at Green Bay, author of numerous books, the latest, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great, and my favorite, Thomas Paine,
and the Promise of America.
Thank you, Harvey. Nice to have you with us.
It's great to be here in studio. It's great.
It's great. And so tell us, how did the Four Freedoms speech that FDR gave, what was it, and how has it influenced American politics to this day?
Okay. In January 1941, January 6th, which is just next week, would be the 75th anniversary, but 75 years ago, FDR, before the war began, knew that he had to mobilize Americans for a defense effort and an effort to support Britain and its allies against Nazi Germany.
Okay, which year was this?
That was 1941, January 41.
Okay.
And he had already given a fireside chat in favor of turning the United States into the arsenal of democracy.
So this was 11 months before Pearl Harbor.
11 months before Pearl Harbor. But he was pretty sure that the war was coming. And this, in many ways, was the actual call to arms by FDR, well ahead of any attack on the United States. Mm-hmm. So he gave us this speech to Congress, calling on Congress to support turning the U.S. into the arsenal of democracy, but also offering a vision of what America and the world might become after the war. And he spoke of four fundamental human freedoms. And first was freedom of speech and expression. The second was freedom of worship. And then he went off in a solidly social democratic direction and spoke of freedom from want and freedom from fear. And those four freedoms became the vision or the promise of the American war effort even before we entered into the war.
Are the first two not covered by the First Amendment?
They are, but it's also the case that if we think about the 1930s New Deal period, the idea of freedom of speech and expression referred to the idea of workers gaining a voice in industry, because central to the democratic campaigns of the 30s under Roosevelt was the idea of industrial democracy, collective bargaining, and the right to organize unions. So that was really fundamental. And then in terms of civil rights, the question of freedom of speech and expression was also important, although he didn't refer to civil rights at that time. But then freedom of worship, which seems to be covered by the First Amendment, was hardly the case. Up until the early 1930s, this was a decidedly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. And both Catholics and Jews were discriminated against, and anti-Semitism was rampant throughout the 1930s. So when Roosevelt spoke of freedom of speech and expression and then freedom of worship, there were a lot of Americans, in fact, the great majority of Americans, who believed that there was also going to be a fight to secure them at home in a democratic way. And the vision, the promise of the four freedoms are really important to the Democratic Party. Even Truman, after the war, began by trying to emphasize those four freedoms, and also a later speech by Roosevelt, which we heard Bernie Sanders redeem in his October address. Was it at Georgetown? September, October, November. The Economic Bill of Rights speech of 1944, laying out a fundamental second Bill of Rights for the United States.
Right. So by freedom from want and freedom from fear, what did FDR mean? How would that play out if today it were enshrined in a constitutional amendment, for example?
That's a really good question, because when Roosevelt stated them as ideas, he didn't refer specifically to the way in which the Americans came to appreciate them. Americans came to appreciate them as freedom from want, meaning there would be a real campaign to raise not only the poor, but also raise working class standards of living. Now, that was fundamental. But he hasn't mentioned that in the speech itself. But Americans, people hear and they lay claim to things. And I think Roosevelt had that in mind, because the words before the four freedoms spoke of creating national health care, guaranteeing jobs, making sure every young person had opportunity. So Americans put them together and heard freedom from want as a real social democratic, a real egalitarian argument. Now, freedom from fear at the time meant we would do everything in our power never to have to suffer the attacks of Nazism and Japanese imperialism. But again, Americans, especially down south, who were black in particular, they heard that as a promise that Jim Crow South would come under siege, and also that they would no longer be subject to the kind of thuggery that white supremacists would pursue. So as I said, he didn't say those things, but Americans heard them given the framing that he offered in the speech. They heard them as we are going to advance democracy. We're not only going to have civil and political democracy, we're going to have social democracy in the United States.
But then 11 months later, Pearl Harbor happened and that conversation came to an end?
Well, it didn't actually come to an end because in the course of the war, the way in which labor became empowered during the war actually raised the living standards of working people dramatically. And especially because of the fact that they could control wages, they actually lifted the poor to a great degree out of poverty during that stretch of time. And it was really a remarkable time. Inequality decreased. In fact, in the late 1930s, accelerating during World War II and continuing, as I think you and I both know, right through the 1970s, we actually reduced inequality by way of the legacy of the New Deal, and then, of course, the Great Society initiatives of the 1960s.
Right, Lyndon Johnson's work.
Right.
And now all that's been reversed since Reagan, basically since Reagan became president.
Yeah, 40 years. Actually begins under Carter and then accelerates under Reagan and has continued to accelerate and continues even today under Obama. And I think really when the Democrats, it's not surprising in some ways that Americans have been so angry about the state of inequality in America and that both Hillary Clinton and especially Bernie Sanders have tried their best to redeem the legacy and the memory of FDR.
What do you think the chances are that fundamental change, FDRian fundamental change, can come to America? My premise or my belief is that it's going to take an economic crisis to make it happen.
Well, let's hope it doesn't take another economic crisis because we saw it in 2008 and we didn't get the kind of progressive advances we needed.
Well,
However,
but we got a presidential candidate who was campaigning on those.
Yes,
Obama
indeed.
said he was going to call together the presidents of Mexico and Canada and redo NAFTA and all this stuff.
Well, there's a top-down kind of view, one we hear from certain Democrats even today, and I think that's what makes this moment interesting because I think what we've seen with Bernie Sanders' support, and especially among young people, is a sense that if we're going to make changes in this country, we ought not merely to vote for someone who wants to be our champion, but we need to vote for someone who not only is going to be a fighter, but is also going to encourage the fight in us. And that's what Roosevelt did.
Right. And that's what Bernie is doing.
And exactly. I was going to say we actually have that candidate in Bernie Sanders. I think the greatest chance of reviving the FDR legacy, not the legacy merely of policies to combat inequality, but literally the struggles necessary to combat inequality will only come with the Bernie Sanders nomination and presidential victory. Yeah.
And there's no way that Bernie will be nominated or become president if he doesn't mobilize an army, essentially, if he, lousy metaphor, military metaphor, but mobilize a movement, to use Bernie's words.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And in that sense, if we don't get a Sanders presidency, if we get a Hillary Clinton presidency based on promises of a Warren and Sanders sort, then it doesn't mean we sit back and wait for the 2020 elections. It means we mobilize now and make things happen even beyond Hillary's own imagination.
Yeah, I think this was the biggest mistake that President Obama made was letting go of his coalition, letting go of his folks. And he's saying, I got this, chill out.
Yeah, which was evident even in his inaugural address in 2009.
Yeah. How so?
Well, in the inaugural address of 2009, he spoke of the we, but he kept speaking of the we in terms of the hard work we needed to overcome the economic recession that was hampering all of our, progress.
The Bush crash.
But he never, ever, Obama, spoke of the struggle for democracy in that 2009 speech.
The struggle for democracy here in the United States.
Here in the United States. It's interesting. He quoted Thomas Paine in his inaugural address, but never mentioned his name. And to me, that was a telling moment. I know it has to, only a historian, perhaps only a Paineite might really become so obsessed. Yeah. But it struck me that if he really wanted to mobilize the American people, he would have gone to the point of mentioning Thomas Paine's name and calling all of us to action in that spirit.
Right. Now is the time to try the tries men's souls.
To try men's souls. You got it.
Harvey Kaye. Harvey, thanks so much for
Thanks, Tom.
Great to have you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And you can tweet Harvey at HarveyJK, Kaye, and his new book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.